So thank you very much, I think, for the ITA, I think, for giving us this invitation. The MDBs, basically to talk about what we do. So I'm going to talk about the projects and sustainable technologies that we're actually promoting in Africa that will help to ensure a water secure future. Yeah, exactly. So my presentation will basically focus on about 4 or 5 attributes. One is financing water, the challenges and the trends, which include both the public and private. Then looking at the AFDB engagement in the water sector, and then the investment areas and technologies that we're looking at, and then looking at financing and knowledge services, and then ultimately sample operations, because at the end of this all, we'd really like to give you an indication of what is coming up in future in terms of a pipeline that would be interesting from a private sector perspective. Now, in Africa, of course, we have got a number of challenges, and I think, like you look on this slide, of course, we are being affected a lot by demography, which basically also influences the kind of access that we have for water and sanitation, and of course, underfunding of infrastructure, and of course, like all my colleagues said, the COVID-19 has basically induced a lot of economic losses. But we're also having the natural legacy that's coming as a result of climate change and variability. So all these complex challenges are basically, further straining the access. Now, like you see on this graphic, I think we have about 400 million people, who still lack, basic access to water services, and about 800 that don't have access to basic sanitation. And at the bottom of it all, you have water which is contaminated, and of course, lack of water and wastewater treatment facilities and inadequate technologies. And I think this is where, companies, especially the private sector, can be very helpful in realizing all this. When we look at the financing gap, basically, on average, we are basically providing about $13 billion of financing into Africa, annually. That's across the MDBs. But of course, the gap is between 43 to 56 billion. And of course, we really hope that with a very strong private sector partnership, I think we shall be able to bridge some of these gaps. Now, what are the financing challenges when it comes to the private sector? I think one is that, of course, there is inadequate water technology infrastructure, especially on the African side. So, you find that the reason why you're unable to actually, reach a bigger, population is because you don't have these well-researched technologies, but also the inadequate pipeline of bankable projects. I think it's one thing, of course, wanting to invest, but then if at all the opportunities actually don't exist, then it's difficult to make the most out of that opportunity. But also, of course, we have inadequate cost-reflective water tariffs. This is basically for the water supply. And then, of course, the gate fee tariffs are also low, basically like for the wastewater sector. The weak enabling environment has, I think, been explained by a number of colleagues. But also, particularly for the water sector, we have a lot of small-scale and fragmented water-related investments. And I think because of the scale, this leads to high transaction costs, and it may not be necessarily attractive to the private sector, which calls for aggregation and partnerships. Now, within the bank, our strategy is basically to try to look at the water security Africa. This is our strategy 2021-2025. And among the pillars that we are looking at, of course, is sustainable water management, but also strengthening the delivery of water, supply, and sanitation and hygiene services. We're also looking at technologies for providing irrigation or sustainable resources for food, and also, of course, increased development of sustainable hydropower. So these are some of the areas that we are looking at promoting as a bank. Now, what are the investment areas that we look at across our portfolio? We invest in industrial water supply, we invest in desalination. This is a new kid on the block that is coming up in most of the semi-arid countries. Actually, at the COP27, I think we are basically trying to discuss how to support the government of Egypt in actually promoting 5 desalination, plants, over the next year, in a public-private partnership. We also have bulk water supply, urban water supply and waste, but also digital water solutions, because we think the private sector can not only provide the hard side, but it can also provide digital solutions that can enable the improvement of the efficiencies of some of these operations. Now, of course, what we do, I think the first and foremost, we basically provide advisory services and knowledge products, basically to help the private sector gain entry, into the market. But we also provide financial services, and different instruments. Like my colleague said, loans, guarantees, that can basically help the entry of the private sector. But we also do have access to services, basically technical expertise, and of course in-house experts that can also help in structuring, and tendering of concessions. Now, the interest for the private sector is basically twofold. On one side, you can participate as contractors. On the other side, you can actually participate as developers. And I think I won't run through this. I think the slides will be available to you. But basically, what it shows is from the borrower perspective, I think what is the requirement, basically, what's the entry point for the public and the private sector. This is the financing trend, basically, for over the last 10 years. And I think it has risen. I think our current portfolio is about $6 billion. But of course, the active pipeline in itself is about $4 billion. And of course, this is a mixture of both public and private investments. Now, coming to the private sector, I mean, one thing that we look at is that the recipients normally should be companies that are basically incorporated and operational in Africa. So that's called for partnership between Italy and then, of course, the national companies, sub-sovereign entities like municipalities, like utilities, and then, of course, river basin organizations. Now, what are the terms? Basically, we look at, we can offer corporate loans, those basically to utilities, which is about 50% of the net assets. And then we have project finance, which is about 33%, especially to the private sector. Then we also offer credit guarantees, 10 years of 5 years and 5-year grace periods. And of course, commercial and competitive terms. Now, of course, in terms of eligibility, we basically look at technical and financial capacity, full financial autonomy, good governance, but also demonstrated additionality. I think we shall have a bit more discussion on a one-on-one on what these terms actually mean. Now, when it comes to projects that are at mature stage, what we look at are the feasibility studies and designs, whether they are done, whether environmental assessments have been done, and of course, the financial models, because I think these basically influence whether you can actually get financial returns. So when it comes to well-structured projects, we basically look at things like cost recovery, and of course, efficient design, and of course, sponsor support as well. This is the average duration that it actually takes, like for typical transactions, right from origination to funding. Depending on the readiness, the average time for a typical private developer could be from 3 to 24 months. I'm now coming to a conclusion, but I want to look at some sample operations that we've actually financed. And I think one of them is the Kigali bulk water supply. This is basically an operation that we finance through a blended financing approach, where basically the bank, and of course the bank, the IFC, and the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund provided about $40 million in debt. And then, of course, $11 million was actually provided as equity finance from a private developer, Metito, that is from Abu Dhabi. So, of course, and then, of course, $6 million TA grant was actually provided by the PADG group. So, these are some of the transactions. So, even on the public side, we've got opportunity for private companies to participate in providing technologies. In this case, Metito actually did the bulk water side. They did the bulk water extraction and the treatment. And then once they agreed on the tariff, we then financed, the evacuation of that water through financing, the transmission lines and the distribution system. So there are a number of such opportunities in the public sector that the private sector can also benefit from. The second one is basically on a multinational construction equity fund. This is a fund that has been set up to which the bank is actually contributing as well. And basically, we are contributing towards an equity fund, which is supposed to raise about $1.2 billion in hard capital. So far, by February, I think we had raised about $600 million, to which the bank is actually contributing as well. And this one is financing several projects that I actually listed earlier across the continent, across a number of countries across the continent. So essentially, there's an entry point for the private sector as well to participate in this kind of arrangement. And then the third is basically looking at a typical project that involves reuse. And this is basically the Glen Valley Wastewater Reuse Project, where we're actually getting new technologies that are being involved in reuse of wastewater, and then using that water to supply about 20% of the city of Gaborone. So this is a typical transaction as well. Of course, the IFC is the lead arranger, but the bank is also providing senior debt in this. As I come towards an end, one is that there are a growing number of public-private partnership arrangements that the private sector in Italy could actually benefit from. These range from bulk water supply projects at different stages of procurement. We have one ongoing in Gabon, Egypt, Morocco, Rwanda, and Botswana. However, we also have a strong appetite for basically municipal solid waste management projects. Excuse me. And then, of course, looking ultimately at aggregation of, small-scale projects. I think these ones are actually being done in Kenya. Now, of course, in which countries do we have most business? I think this just shows the 20 countries. I think the trend, basically, over the next 3 years, most of our business, both public and private, will be in that order, in Zambia, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa, Uganda. So it basically just shows, if you follow the links, you'll actually be able to see what kind of projects they actually intend to actually, promote in those countries, which ones are private, which ones are public. And I think it's a good starting point for the private sector in terms of provision of knowledge. Now, my second last slide, this just shows a portfolio for 2023 that we are trying to look at basically across, these ones are basically private developers. But like I said, we also have sovereign operations or public operations where the private sector can basically also operate. I talked about the large ticket, which is the desalination plant, and I think it would be interesting in case any of the developers are interested in desalination, because we're actually going to promote this in Egypt, in Tunisia already, we are promoting it in Morocco, in Mauritania, and of course in many of these countries that actually are being affected by water stress. So thank you very much for your presentation. There's a lot more information after this that shows exactly which countries are interested in what kind of technologies. So I think when you get to the presentation, you should be able to look at, zoom into specific countries and then find out what the opportunities are. And then there are also colleagues who basically investment officers that deal with different regions. So I provided that slide as well, so that in case in future you actually need specific information on these operations, you're able to get to them. Thank you very much for your attention.